Actually kick us off. So hopefully everyone can see this. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. You heard what this presentation is about. We called it Betrayal and Forgiveness. You'll learn what betrayal and forgiveness is all about. It's really about sneaking quantitative methods into substantive teaching and assessment in politics and international relations. And there will be a lot of questions that I and Adrian will raise, but there will be hopefully some answers for you as well. And we work with a lot of examples to give you an indication what can be done from our own teaching. And I will in particular talk about a course that I've taught a couple of times now on democratization, which admittedly allows a lot of quantitative methods in terms of just teaching how to read them, but also how to do data analysis and hands-on teaching. So there will be some examples in that respect. So the idea is that we talk for roughly 45 minutes and give you a lot of opportunity to ask questions. So please feel free to use the chat. At the moment, I can't see the chat, but we'll get to the questions after we've gone through the presentation. You will notice, or some of you might notice, betrayal and forgiveness, and the similarity with a music title of a cello metal band is not an accident. And you'll hear little sequences of it during the presentation, just to give you an indication how bad betrayal might be and how nice forgiveness might be. So that's the idea of the presentation. In general, let me see if I can click. I can click. So the idea is that we have roughly 5 steps to success. So I want to talk a little bit about general considerations first, because we want to go through a whole course planning really. Then go through the whole betrayal part. So what's the course outline? What do we pass on to students? How do we cheat on them by sneaking in quantitative methods? There will be then a part on the forgiveness part. Do they actually forgive you for doing this? And how successful is this? I want to talk about something that we call the energy vampire. So what sucks most of the energy out of you when you try to implement quantitative methods into substantive teaching? And there's some concluding thoughts and obviously some discussion points as well. So let me just start with the general considerations. So as I said, there will be a lot of questions, and here are the first ones. So when I started thinking about this course in particular, the question was for me, what do I really want students to learn? In terms of quantitative methods, but also in terms of substantive content. So one idea, I initially adopted a course on democratization. I looked at the course outline, I liked it, but I felt something was missing. And there was this quantitative component, reading data, maybe even applying little bits and pieces of data analysis that I wanted students to learn. So for me, and I should make that clear, the idea was to combine both. I wanted them to learn how to read graphs, tables, and things like that, but I also wanted them to apply some skills and to learn some skills so that they can do simple things themselves. I think one crucial question is, what am I actually able to teach students? And this is more a reflection on the lecturer. So what am I able to teach in terms of the skills that I have? If I don't know regression, I wouldn't want to teach regression, I suppose. Things like that. If I don't understand something, I feel uncomfortable teaching it. That's one thing. And also, what am I able to teach students in terms of, do I have enough time? Do I have the equipment that I need to teach students these quantitative skills and other things? The third big question is obviously, how can I take math fear out of the equation? Mostly social science students, PIR students are not in PIR to do anything that's math related. I think it's always important to teach or to tell students that statistics, quantitative analysis is not necessarily about maths. It's about applying things, so you can teach things in an applied way. And how can I take that out of the equation would be one thing. And you'll get some examples very shortly. One big question, we'll get back to that, I suppose, in the discussion as well, is what's the balance of methods and substantive content? So do I focus on the method? Do I focus on the substantive content? Where's leeway for making mistakes as well? And I will talk a little bit about where I made my mistake when I ran this course that I will be talking about first time, and how I balanced that out by the end of the day. And lastly, I think it's also important to think about what is the methods tradition at my institution, or in particular in my department. So there are very strong quantitative departments across the country. If you think about the Q-Step initiative, for example, and the methods teaching starts at level 1 for first-year students, and they will have a much higher understanding of methods, qualitative and quantitative, than departments or students in departments where methods are not so prominent, where we are more politics rather than political science focused. And I think that's quite important. I worked in both kinds of departments, and it's once again very important to think about that, because there might be an assumption that you scare away students with anything that's mildly quantitative if your department is not as methodsy focused. And I think these are general considerations before actually planning out the course, before it goes into this whole process that we have at our institutions where courses are approved. I need to run a little bit of music for you now, because we get to the betrayal part. And I mentioned a sad band called Apocalyptica, and here is Betrayal. This is how betrayal sounds. You can sense the anger in the whole thing. And I want to start, I stop this now. I want to start talking about the course design and how to cheat students even at the course design stage. So for me, the question was, what's the substantive topic? It was very clear because the course guide initially was given to me, and it was democratization. So how or why do countries become and stay democratic? So I had that in mind, but some of you might not have that. So it's quite important to think about very carefully what is the substantive topic. Things like voting behavior, very clear methodological component there. We have lots of data on turnout and why people vote for parties, for example. Other topics might not be so obvious. If, in particular, if I think about international relations topics, if people want to do strategic studies, war and peace, it may not come to mind initially that there might be data out there, quantitative methods out there, but there are. And I think that's an important thing to think about. Does the topic, the substantive topic that we're thinking about, actually allow integrating some methodsy things? And I think my spoiler would be that most topics do, even international relations, human rights, war and peace. There's a lot of stuff out there. Even international organizations produce data on expenditure on war or human rights violations and things like that, that can be used even in a simple, easy, descriptive way. Third question, once again, I want to start off with questions, is how simple or sophisticated should the methodsy component be? Once again, I think the important aspect here is, what's the tradition in teaching in the department? Have students had a methods course in which they learned about SPSS or Excel or Stata or R, whatever the software package is, which also gives you an indication of how sophisticated your methodsy components could be. If they didn't have it, how simple do I have to go? Can I just give them simple descriptive graphs, or can I even move beyond and give them more sophisticated inferential analysis, for example, to read? And then lastly, obviously, the focus is important. So focus on reading and interpreting research based on quantitative methods, or is the idea also to learn skills to conduct simple, sophisticated quantitative analysis? For me, the answer was, I want both to some extent, and I want to give you some examples of how this has been achieved. And the course that I've adopted is democratization. At the time, we had a less prominent quantitative approach at undergraduate level. So in the department, we have one methods course that runs at level 3 out of 4 levels. And this course runs at level 4, so in the final year of the students. And I thought that was quite important. It's quite important to emphasize that. For me, the learning outcomes were that reading and critically evaluating quantitative output is important, but I also wanted to encourage students to continue what they do in the methods course, where we get them to, I believe what we do is cross tabulations, 3-way cross tabulations, maybe the odd correlation, those kinds of things. But to move a little bit beyond that, learn to set out hypotheses, to test hypotheses, and do some simple quantitative analysis. And I guess everywhere we have the idea of enhancing employability skills. So the idea was to enhance employability skills by teaching them the skills, but also by giving them sort of different assessments. And I'll talk about assessment a little bit later. So different assessments than just the ordinary essay that we mostly give our students or have given. I know there's a shift into diversification. So essays and exams. And you see on the screen a little extract from the course guide. So sneaking in some quantitative methods. And this is the revised version. Initially, I didn't have the Excel or SPSS in that. This is the latest version where I did sneak more of Excel and SPSS in. So this course offers an introduction to the changing nature actually of democracy and dictatorship. We focus on why countries become democratic and stay democratic, and the best conditions of why countries stay democratic after transitioning. Moreover, the course outlines problems of putting democracy into practice in today's world. And then the course also introduces and follows the process of conducting empirical research by introducing the nature, limitations, and possible applications of different analytical tools. I think this is where the sentence originally ended. And I added in and research methods, including simple quantitative analysis using Excel and or SPSS. Why did I do that? The course ran last year and this year again. And after last year, I realized that some students were confused about this empirical tweak, about the quantitative tweak, and they would have liked to know more about it. So I figured this time I improve this and add in that there will be simple quantitative analysis. And the decision I made was to teach them both Excel and SPSS, which was a higher burden in terms of workload. But students who may not be so eager to do quantitative stuff felt Excel was a little bit easier to them than SPSS, even though I heard after the course that some people actually decided, well, actually SPSS is much easier because I have to do less clicking. So there is a two-way component here as well to teach them the skills in two different software packages. If I move on further, Betrayal, and this is about the course delivery. So how did I structure the course, or how could one structure a course to integrate quantitative teaching? I think important considerations here are, what is the structure of the course? First of all, in terms of the ratio of lecturing and tutorial time, for instance, or under what label does the course run? So for us here in Aberdeen, it's normally 2 hours of lecturing and a tutorial. We can be more flexible, but we have administrative constraints and we have to stick to things that we promise, obviously. So normally this course would run as a 2-hour lecture and a 1-hour tutorial, which obviously with COVID, there will be some COVID slides, also shifted around a little bit. So there's limited time in the tutorials to teach students about quantitative stuff, whereas a lot of that needs to be done in the lectures because that's where we've got the time. I also wanted to think about, can I actually deliver methods and content effectively using an applied approach, or is statistical background required, and if so, how much? So for me, I'm an applied researcher. I do know my equations as well, and that's helpful for me because I usually can pull them out of my head. And teach a little bit about the equations. But I think one critical question is, am I prepared to provide the statistical background if need be? This has shifted, obviously, if you're in live teaching, and I guess we are mostly asynchronous these days. You really need to know your stuff and prepare the things and be able to have that ad hoc. In the asynchronous environment, I think it's a bit easier. It could be part of additional material that you provide. It could be partly covered in tutorials. But I'm always trying to prepare myself that I have things at hand if anyone asks, because sometimes we do have these eager students, even though they might be a little bit scared of the methods, but who know things and who want the details behind it. One other thing I think is important is, how can I support methods in learning effectively using other means than lecturing and tutorials? And I have, even before we had our COVID year now, shifted towards recording little videos. So really for the skills training, to do sort of a flipped classroom design and record a little video on using the data in Excel, in SPSS, how to obtain the things that I wanted them to obtain, such as correlations, for example, talk them through, narrate along, for them to have something they can go to, watch it, and then repeat what they've learned, or actually apply it to a new topic, new variables, something like that. And I think that's one thing that's quite important. Last year, I also shared some videos by other scholars or other people, YouTube videos on how to obtain correlations, how to do a regression in either software package, which was helpful to some extent, but I also got the request, can we actually do it on our own data? So once again, higher workload because you need to create these things, but it definitely pays off, and students start to forgive you already at this point because they know they're in good hands and they get some support. Lastly, is it possible to integrate additional explanations in the provided material? So one idea would be lecture slides with additional explanations, give them more than you would actually talk about in the lecture to some extent. If I have a graph, to provide a separate slide in which I actually outline what the graph says, even though in the lecture you would do that and not read out the second slide, it's quite useful if you share the lecture slides with your students and they can just go back without watching videos, or if we are back to live teaching that they don't even have videos potentially, and they can just go through the slides and see, oh, this is what it means. This is what the graph is all about, or what the table is all about. So once again, some examples here. So what I worked with is timelines, because I think that's sort of employability. Students may want to be able to create timelines for their dissertations or even for future projects, scatter plots and correlations, or in combination with correlations. I tried to teach them regression tables and also some marginal effects plots, but this is somewhere where we ended. I also did give them simple rules of thumb for interpretation, so they didn't have to learn anything about probability as such, or how we understand probability or the statistical background, but they got a rule of thumb on how to read probability values, for example, and what a probability value is. Some of these things they also learned to create, so the timeline scatter plots, and last year also regression. This year we didn't get to that. I created videos for that so that they can watch them and actually learn it. I should re-emphasize that mostly for many things that are used, even from substantive papers, research papers, I tried to recreate a lot of things, especially timelines and scatter plots. Regression tables were more difficult, but I tried to actually recreate this and create the videos recreating this so that they can see, if I can do it, they can do it, and they have the video to actually be guided along. And once again, I did that in Excel and SPSS. So here are some of the things you see. For democratization, there's an excellent textbook by Clark, Golder and Golder, which guides you through, and you see a little regression table in the bottom corner there, where they also say, here's the coefficient, here's the standard error, so more sophisticated output. And I would give them some slides how to read these things. You do see at the top here a timeline where created measures of democracy and how they move across time. And this would be something that you'd find in the very same book. But I try to recreate that, downloading all the data sets just to show this is how easily it's done. You also see something from the Economist intelligence unit. So they worked with maps and once again classifying countries into authoritarian and democratic, which I think are quite useful sometimes to give them to read. Unfortunately, the data is not available for public use, so I couldn't recreate everything using the Economist measure. You do see on the right-hand side some data output in this case. Once again, I recreated here the number of military monarchy and civilian dictatorships, and this would be a figure, once again, the Clark Golder book. And then there's something on correlation and scatter plots, which is just crossing a democracy measure with an inequality index. And these would be the things that I would give them in the lectures and sometimes ask them to recreate this for or in advance this year, the tutorials. More here, this is once again more about reading things. And here's my point also on describing a little bit what we see in the graph. So this is a research paper on COVID and democracy dictatorship, or the pandemic, and when authoritarian regimes and democracies actually moved to more severe measures. And the graph is actually not so hard to understand, but I think it's quite important to just give them once again the core features and say, this is what we see on the y-axis. And in this case, it's the severity, referring to severity measures taken. And the x-axis would just see the cumulative death rate. So this is really country data. And just the core message of what we see. And in this case, we would see that dictatorships moved to more severe measures at a smaller number of death rates compared to democracies. And this is something that I would normally embed into my slides, but not necessarily as a separate slide, or would not talk them through two different slides. I would give them the graph, talk about the graph in my video or in my live lecture, but then add to the slides the interpretation of what we see. Second example from the very same paper would be when they broke it down by different domains, so schools, meetings, lockdowns, and work. And once again, you see the graphs on the one hand side and then a little explanation on the other side. And I think it's incredibly important for students to just get this explanation, at least to have it at hand, especially if they prepare for, say, exams or quizzes or whatever we do in terms of assessment, so that they can go back and see, oh yeah, this is how you interpret such a graph. Other things that, in terms of methodsy stuff, I tried to give them is the idea of scatter plots. Some may have never heard of a scatter plot, so I found it incredibly helpful, or students found it helpful, to just tell them, well, basically it's very simple. It just crosses two continuous measures for us in a graph. So it's somewhat like a cross table, isn't it? Just a visual. A visual of a cross table in a way, with a different measurement, obviously, but one dot just plots whatever the case we have, or the dots are just where whatever case, if we look at countries in my case, has information on both of these measures. And I think I just had inequality and democracy on one graph and one slide. So I would try to explain it to them in that way. And then ask them to just look at the overall patterns. Where do you see groups of clusters of dots? Where do you see cases standing out? Can we track down what this case is, what country it is, for example? And I usually teach it in combination with correlation, so they learn how to calculate an association, a correlation between these two continuous variables, which just tells us basically whether or not there's at all an association between these two measures, if it's positive or negative, and how strong it is. And if I teach significance, I varied on that across the years. If they use SPSS, it's automatically given, so it's necessary to tell them about significance, also if it is statistically significant. So these would be my explanations in the videos in the lecture mostly. Sort of direction of the correlation, I would then indicate, you know, this is the range of our correlation coefficient. -1 is the perfect negative relationship, +1 the perfect positive relationship, 0 no relationship at all. And it also helps, I think, to tell them what it means substantively in a way. So as values on one variable increase, values on the other variable decrease, or vice versa if it's a positive relationship, just to give them an indication on how to read this and what this means, and to embed it substantively. In terms of the strength, I would give them some cutoff points, basically, and just indicate roughly this is how you would read it. So 0 to 0.19 would be no relationship, also in the negative. 0.2 to 0.29 is a weak relationship. 0.3 to 0.59 is a moderate relationship. Everything exceeding 0.6, and for all of it also in the negative, would be a strong relationship. And that just gives us an indication of our democracy in this case, and say inequality related at all. Similarly, even moving on to probability values, I would just give them a very simple idea of probability. So probability stands, P stands for probability, a p-value stands for probability, and ranges from 0 to 1. A smaller p-value indicates that we can be more confident in what we've identified, and that we identified a relationship on the sample. That also applies to the population as a whole. So that indicates that they need to know a little bit about sample and population. For us, for this course, it's quite clear because they learn that in the methods course, and I would assume that they have a rough idea of that. And then I would give them the cutoff points for the p-values as well. And you see that on the slide here as well, in both directions, either saying you can be 90% confident that you found something on the sample. That also applies to the population, or there's only a 10% chance that we found this by accident, or 95, 99%. So this is normally what I would give them at hand to be able to read the correlation coefficient scatter plots and also to judge the probability values. You see here just some screenshots. I'm meant to embed a little video, but I deemed it not so important that you see another video in a video. But you see some screenshots of the videos that I've taken. So this is the actual data for the timelines, for example, that I created. And you've seen the graph on one of the earlier slides where we had 4 measures of democracy and how they move over time. And you see both Excel and SPSS output here. One is for scatter plots and one is for timelines, actually. And I actually narrated along while I was going through the data, talked them through what we see in the different columns, what each row represents, then clicked them through the options that they had in SPSS, in Excel, and narrated along. It can be quite tiring to narrate along all the time, but it definitely is worth the effort in this one. And sometimes I had my talking head in the corner, you see that as well. I think that is not necessary for these skills-based videos because they don't need to see my talking head in that sense. They need to see what I'm doing. And if you narrate along, I think you can easily just get rid of the talking head in those skills-based videos or video tutorials. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the betrayal in terms of regression output. I keep it simple, and you've seen the regression table from the Clark-Golder book. So what I would point them to is the direction of the regression coefficient and the standard error of the regression coefficient, because these things are important. And then we also talk a little bit about stargazing or the asterisks, but I'll get to that. So I would normally just give them an indication. What does a positive coefficient mean? What does a negative coefficient mean? And basically, I guess for most regression outputs, it doesn't necessarily matter so much to go into too much detail. All they need to know is what 1 unit increase means on the independent variable for the dependent variable. And that's sort of the rule of thumb that I would give them, or 1 unit increase on the independent variable leading to 1 unit decrease on the dependent variable. Sometimes they find it hard to get their head around this, but most students, from my experience, have done really well in this, especially if they get a rule of thumb at hand or have that at hand as well. Talking about that is the standard error of the regression coefficient. So once again, I would give them an example. Normally, they would look at a table. I would point out it's typically provided in parentheses next or below the regression coefficient, not necessarily. Sometimes you have a separate column or something, just to let them know. And roughly again, tell them, you know, it indicates really how confident we can be about the results. And here is our rule of thumb. If the regression coefficient is twice as high as the standard error, you can be 95% confident, or there's only a 5% chance that you found this relationship by accident. Whereas if the regression coefficient is 3 times as high as the standard error, you can even be more confident, 99% confident, or there's only a 1% chance that you found this by accident. And they do like these rules of thumb. And I think it's nice practice to have them look at standard errors and regression coefficients at the same time. I did not assess that in the past in terms they have to do this as well, run a regression, but I did assess whether they can read it. And most students actually performed quite well on that. And you'll get examples of a quiz that I've done this year, actually. I also point them to stargazing, although I like to scale that down a little bit, but they do know, obviously, about the little stars in the corners. And the stars obviously can mean different things as well, depending on what the table footnote means. And I think it's important to point that out as well. So there is a relationship between the stars, the standard error, the coefficient, and you can look at stars, but you always need to read the table footnotes to understand what the stars actually mean. And there are some or various other examples beyond this particular course. I would think there's a lot of leeway to embed descriptive graphs of turnout, obviously. Development of wealth I've seen, just how does GDP move, for example. Spending on the military, I mentioned that earlier. The number of tweets by Donald Trump during the campaign, scatter plots of level of democracy by globalization, rising COVID cases, attitudes towards the environment. I guess there's not one area in politics and IR that I can think of where you can't embed quantitative output, to be honest. For us here in Aberdeen, I think cross tables are something that they use. chi-square tests not so often, but we're getting there. But obviously that there's leeway to look at gender attitudes, for example, by political leaning or something like that. And there's obviously a lot of leeway for regression output, predicting turnout, marginal effects of civic duty on turnout, vote choice, or other things. And I think I'm handing over to Adrian. Adrian, just let me know when you want me to click, maybe.
Yeah, so I teach a very similar course to Kat at Durham. The key sort of difference is being that I teach level 1 democratization, and I don't sort of give them original data to get to grips with. But other than that, the approaches are incredibly similar, so I won't talk for too long. But sort of one thing that I think we both agree on, regardless of whether you teach the original analysis and sort of getting to grips with Excel and SPSS, or whether you kind of just work around it and talk about, you know, regression tables and interpretation, all of these key things which really, to engage with democratization or any political science, you just have to know in order to really get to grips with the literature. One really important thing to focus in on is giving them easy ways to get to grips with what findings are showing them. Show the average student, particularly at level 1, a t-test or a chi-square test, and it just invokes, you know, a bit more fear. You know, what am I really looking at? You know, you stare at the piece of paper, not necessarily really getting to grips with what it's showing you. And I think one really easy way of getting around this is to try and choose papers where there's really good graphical interpretations, which, you know, just help students get to grips with what is showing. And I know the examples that I've got up here for today are more geared towards electoral politics, but, you know, whatever political science topic you're looking at, try and choose resources that will sort of enable that sort of leap, and that student, and for students to be able to make the leap between, you know, the graphical sort of suggestions of patterns and the inferential leap. So, you know, helping them bridge that gap. And there are lots of different ways of doing this, whether you want, you know, comparisons of means. In the case of this data here, it gives you a very sort of easy way of understanding where means are and whether they are fairly similar within two groups or fairly different. Kat, do you want to go to the next slide? Similarly, correlations, incredibly useful to have scatter plots to demonstrate patterns. And again, even students at level 1 with very little knowledge, if we can start making it more normal that you see these graphs and these are a part of teaching, and they're expected to understand and be able to engage with them, it just makes the rest of their university experience, you know, much more pleasant. So again, in here, you know, they would be able to see, you know, a fairly obvious pattern between the two variables. And in the next slide, you know, much sort of less clear patterns, and allow these to be used to really help them understand what's going on. And similarly, regardless of the type of data, even if we have categorical data as in the last slide, again, you know, making sense of patterns becomes so much easier the second you put in a graph to help them understand what's going on. The only other thing I was going to mention is in relation to p-values, which Kat has talked a little bit about. And again, giving visual aids within lecture slides to help them understand. And although you'd think it would be a fairly easy thing, you know, to remember whether a number's below or above 0.05, oftentimes this takes a little bit of sticking in someone's head. And if you can give them really nice visual cues to engage with and help them remember. So in this case, really disappointed, miserable looking Man United fans, or a very, very happy Steven Gerrard celebrating, you know, a Champions League victory years and years ago, still feels fairly recent. It can just help them, you know, make that sort of eureka moment where these things start clicking in their head. So I'll pass back over to you, Kat.
Thank you. I can only re-emphasize what Adrian said. I use a lot of visuals as well, just to re-emphasize things, or cartoons even. There are lots of fun methodsy cartoons that that students seem to like. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about course assessment here, because course assessment is obviously very crucial for us. And once again, it's important to think about, what do I want to assess? Do I want to assess reading and interpretation skills, or actually doing things? So skills in terms of constructing, doing analytical skills. And I think one big question is always, how can I best assess these methods, these skills? Can I do it in exams? Yes, traditionally you can do that. You can give them a graph to analyze. You can give them a table to analyze. They look at it. They need to interpret it, basically. They can also do things, though, in essays. So I shifted towards having them write an empirical essay where they actually do some skills. They have to create some graphs, and they then have to interpret them and embed them into the substantive context. Or if you're one of those people who want more sophisticated output, I've done this before as well. I've asked students to just submit the code, but this obviously requires that they work with code, SPSS syntax, do files, or R scripts, for example, and just provide me with a code and a brief interpretation in sort of comments using the commenting function. And that can also be very effective and can be used throughout the term. And then sometimes there would be a final paper as well. I also think it's important to think about any potential obstacles, even post-assessment. I've got an example from this year where I used a quiz to assess sort of the reading and interpretation of data. And I will show you some of the results and tell you how I dealt with it in just a second, really. So once again, from this democratization course that I taught at level 4, the assessment was quite diverse, I think. I didn't want to over-assess, so they had to write a little policy brief in which I also asked them, so I think the topic was to write what institutional design they would recommend for a post-war country. And I gave them 5 countries, such as Afghanistan, and they could either journey back to the time of the intervention, or they could take Afghanistan as it stands today and write what would be the best institutional design to sustain democracy or establish democracy. I also wanted them to reflect on the society in a way. And for this, I asked them specifically, and many did a really stellar job at that, to go and investigate a little bit. What does the society look like in terms of, are there ethnic minorities? What's the shift, or what's the share of different religions, for example? And I think the best essays I've got, they actually went to official statistics or international organizations to see if they could find out some numbers, and even created like a little table or something like that, which was specifically not requested. I just wanted them to talk about it. But the really good ones actually went this far, and I thought that was a very nice sign that they felt quite comfortable using some numbers or looking into numbers, which was nice to see, to be honest. I also had a little quiz, which was 25% weighted, which really is just an online exam dressed up as a quiz from my point of view. But that's once again the betrayal part. This time we don't betray the students, but we betray maybe our organizations that we're not doing online exams because they are a quiz. And then I had this empirical essay in which I asked them to write a little literature review, set out 3 hypotheses, and then test these 3 hypotheses, creating some scatter plots and some correlation coefficients and discussing them. Obviously, this is not a directional test that they are applying, but they could just then discuss that in the conclusion discussion section as well. So that was then to more or less assess the skills in doing quantitative analysis. I just wanted to give you some bits and pieces from the quiz. So here would be one quiz question. Once again, these timelines that I created on different democracy measures. So you see on the left-hand side, this little screenshot, question 3, which had a table as PDF attached to it. The accessibility score is not as great at this point, but you know, they all could read it. I had no complaints about that. And I set it up as a multiple choice in this case, and there were 3 correct answers, as you can see. And I originally set it up as an all or nothing approach. So they needed to log all 3 correct answers to get the 10 points that were assigned to this question. And this was nothing new. This was something that we discussed in the lecture and also in the tutorials when I when I taught them the skills of how to create these timelines. And that was actually part of the live session as well. So this is one thing that's more descriptive. I also had them analyze some scatter plots. Here we do see democracy and globalization. So data from 2017, obviously finding data from this year is much harder, but I think this was the latest I could find for both of these measures. And once again, they could download it. They had enough time to download it. I gave them the correlation coefficient, and then they had different options to select from. And again, it was an all or nothing design. So they had to log these 3 correct answers. And if they logged the D answer as well, that would have been undesirable because they got no points at all. I'll get back to this aspect in just a second. And then the last thing in the quiz that I did is, in this case, I think this is actually a regression that I calculated on the data that they worked with for their essays as well. So they got a little regression table, p-values indicated, stars indicated, and same principle. It was an all or nothing design. They just had to log the correct answers and read very carefully. So the instructions that I gave them, also in a little guidance video, because it was COVID year, was just read carefully, think about the questions. They definitely had enough time to complete the quiz, and most of them agreed with me that they had enough time to complete the quiz, but they really needed to read carefully what are the correct answers, what is the question, what do I need to log, and think about it. One caveat of the all or nothing approach for me, and this relates back to what can I do post-assessment. So the all or nothing for the regression and for the scatterplot approach didn't seem to work that well. So I had, because it's automatically marked, I had quite a few students who got penalized very heavily because they forgot one answer or they logged one incorrect answer and then didn't get any points. So I discussed this extensively with our exams officer, and I said, you know, if it's in their favor, can I change the rules after the assessment? And it was all fine. It has been fine with external examination and everything as well. But what I decided to do is then to also assign partial credit. Just to go back one slide, because here we had 3 correct answers. The decision that I made after the assessment was then, instead of do all or nothing, I gave 5 points for 1 correct answer, 10 points for 2 correct answers, and full points for 3 correct answers. And I dumped the incorrect answers. So even if someone here had now logged all 4 answers, they would have gotten 20 points because it was in their favor. And I think most of the students on the course got heavily penalized by the rule all or nothing. And where I had 2 correct answers, it would have been 10 points or 20 points following the same principle. And all of the students, not one didn't get anything, all of the students benefited from the rule. And I think it was a much fairer approach. And if I had known this before I set the assessment, even better, but I didn't. But they were all happy when I announced, you know, you got partial credit now for these 6 questions, I think, that I had that were so empirically led. And they were all happy with that, no complaints about that. The democratization essay was what explains democracy and dictatorship. I wanted an introduction, a literature review, as said, setting out directional hypotheses backed with some core theory, a little data method section. Obviously, they got the data from me. I compiled the data set on the basis of the core democracy measures, but also OECD, UN data that I compiled. Sort of the inspiration came from Pippa Norris, who has done that. She compiled a cross-sectional data set years and years ago, which I used in the past, but obviously that's outdated at some point, and I decided I need to update it and use measures that I know my students are interested in as well. So once again, a bit heavy on the workload for me in that sense, but definitely worth the effort, I think. Then they had to present and discuss the generated output either in Excel. They had to do it in Excel or SPSS and then discuss it either way. And I wanted in the conclusion a clear evaluation whether the analysis supported the hypotheses or contradicted the hypotheses. The data, again, were compiled and provided just for this particular purpose. And I did not specifically ask them to confirm the hypothesis. So I said to them, don't go through all the variables and find something that confirms your hypothesis. That's not a marking criterion. I want you to talk about this transparently, make a transparent conclusion. And if the outcome of your 3 hypotheses is, well, they were all not great because my data analysis contradicted them all, that's fine. So I did make that very, very clear. And I think that took some pressure off the students as well. And they obviously had the videos of how to generate the output. So they just had to apply what they learned on the example data set, basically. Some other examples, I think, that I could think of for a non-democratization course, any other course which would assess both skills and reading interpreting results. It could be a presentation format. So for example, what we've done in the methods course, because it was COVID year and we wanted to sort of reduce the burden to some extent, is that we also asked them to set out a research hypothesis, talk a little bit about the background of these variables. We provided them with the core data. And then ask students to investigate this research hypothesis using a specific procedure. So maybe create a bar chart or a pie chart. We had in the methods course bivariate analysis, so they had to generate some cross tables. They could also run a correlation, for example, a scatter plot, or if you want more sophisticated things, do some more multivariate methods or use regression, for example, to test things. The students were then asked to present this in a slides format, so they could use PowerPoint or LaTeX, or whatever they felt comfortable with, and to interpret briefly in a few bullet points the results. So once again, we gave the students the instruction to give a clear evaluation whether the analysis supported or contradicted the hypothesis. And for us, we had a very big course, almost 200 students. So the idea was that we assign a country in a cross-national data set to each student. Obviously, some had the same countries, but we just randomly assigned that. And the students did have to do this specific country, and every student used the same 2 or 3 variables to do the analysis. Obviously, they could still collaborate. It was much harder, obviously, in the online environment this year, but this seemed to have worked really well. I was quite pleased to see the outcome, and students seem to be happy. And it actually gives them a little bit more training, even than skills and interpretation, because they also learn the presentation skills in a way to condense the information on just a few slides. And I think, if I remember correctly, we gave them the restriction of 7 or 8 slides. So they had literally a welcome slide, a thank you slide, and then just a limited number of slides in which they could present their research. I also wanted to talk just briefly about pandemic struck. So what has the pandemic done to quantitative teaching and sneaking quantitative analysis into substantive teaching? I think last year when this democratization course ran, obviously we were all in shock in a way, because one day I was in the office, on the next day I was at home, and I haven't returned to my office since. So it was really difficult in a way to deal with this. I think what helped students this year, last year was a bit lost because of that, but this year I think what helped them was a mix of scheduled live teaching and the sort of skills-based videos. I think they liked to see things in videos, but they also like to see little mistakes you make as a lecturer in the live teaching. So I did, for example, the timelines I did in the tutorials, and I did it live by screen sharing, and obviously clicked on something stupid and it didn't work out, and basically said, see, we make mistakes too, but not a problem. I know exactly what the mistake was. Here is how you correct it. And I think that's quite helpful for them to see as well, that, yeah, there might be an obstacle, there might be an error, but you can fix it. Which they wouldn't necessarily see in the videos. Although I've now come to the conclusion from last year pandemic to this second term that I'm not even correcting my mistakes in the videos. I clicked on incorrect things in SPSS at some point, and I just said, you know what, this was not right, and I tell you why it wasn't right. So I narrated along, continued narrating along, cleared my SPSS window, and showed them then the correct way of doing this. And I think that's quite helpful. I also found that the virtual whiteboard was a lifesaver. So I used the whiteboard throughout the teaching, especially in the tutorials. At the beginning, they could ask questions. They could also, I allowed them to write on my slides. I know that's not everyone's preference, but I thought it worked quite well. Students did not complain. when people actually typed on the slides. That was fine by me. I didn't get confused by it, but I think it was a real lifesaver, because otherwise it's just talking to the void, and they could interrupt. I allowed them to interrupt by typing on the slide and asking methodological questions as well. Pandemic struck also meant increased troubleshooting by email and also video calls, using screen sharing, for example. In the methods module, I had quite a few students who got so stressed, and I had them in tears on a video call, but they all made it, and they were all quite happy that they could talk to someone, that we could fix the issue, and they all made it through it. And I think they were very appreciative of the time that was obviously dedicated to helping them to troubleshoot. And troubleshooting could also just be how to set up SPSS, how we download it, how it opens up on different operating systems and things like that. I used increased communication via announcement. If I found a mistake in a data set or just wanted to communicate something, I just sent out an email to everyone. Or if I noted there was questions that were coming in about an assignment, about the quiz, about the essay or so, I made sure that if I had a question more than twice, I sent an announcement so that everyone was on the same page. I think what I underestimated last year, but what I've learned within this term, is the opportunity to learn about what's possible and what students are capable of. And I think most of our students are capable of a lot of things, and they just don't know it. If they have written mostly essays in the past and haven't had other assessments, haven't done empirical approaches, they don't know about it. But I think once they learn what empirical methods, let it even be qualitative methods, are about, they understand how systematic they work, they actually start liking this. So I'm very optimistic that this is something that even during the pandemic might work really well. And that's some thoughts on the pandemic. I do apologize. I need to play a little bit of a sequence once again, because we now get to the forgiveness part. And forgiveness sounds somewhat like this. It's much more mellow. It's a very nice song, in fact, but it's the forgiveness part. And the forgiveness part we normally get, let me stop this, in the course evaluations. And I think before I get to the actual evaluations, I just wanted to talk about the feedback forms. So what you see on the left-hand side here is just our ordinary feedback form as it would display at the University of Aberdeen. We can change it, so every course coordinator can make their own decision what you want to change. And I thought, and this is relating back to earlier years, it's important to ask them why they signed up for this particular democratization module, because I wanted to know whether it is actually the empirical tweak that they liked about the course, or why they signed up. And I didn't want to specifically prompt them that. So I asked, why did you sign up for this course? I also added a question on how they felt about the empirical part of the course, because I needed to know for myself, is this a good tweak to the course? I also asked them, do you think the course helped you to acquire employability skills? Maybe that's a slightly leading question, just thinking about that, but it is important to hear from them. I think if they think they actually learned something, that's quite useful for them. And then I added also a question if they would recommend the course to other students, because I thought that was quite important to capture as well. And here are some of the testimonials from last year and from this year, and this is predominantly positive. I know there's a lot of issues with feedback forms, and many students who are happy fill them in, and some who hated the course would fill them in, but the response rates are quite low. This is a mix of this year's and last year's feedback, and let me just highlight things so you don't have to read everything. What I thought was just wonderful to see is that quantitative analysis doesn't need to be scary. It's a matter of how you teach it, that you give them the applied approach, that they thought the empirical part was valuable. It was actually enjoyable. So you see enjoyable a couple of times. It helped with employability skills. It was appreciated, enhanced my employability, but also things like patience and explanation are quite important. But I quite like to read that something that has until now scared me no longer scares me, and that was clearly referring to the quantitative methods and the qualitative methods that were taught as well. And I think this is just the forgiveness part. Students know that this is useful for them. Lastly, I think, or pretty much lastly, I wanted to talk about the energy vampire. So what made this course so hard and sucked all the energy out of me? Some may know this character here from I think it's on the BBC series, What We Do in the Shadows. So this would be the energy vampire who sucks up all the energy from all the people around them. For this particular course, it was definitely finding and compiling data sets. I tend to enjoy these things, so I dedicated time to it, and I enjoyed compiling spreadsheets and things like that. This can be shared, of course, or you can employ secondary data such as Pippa Norris's, which is a little bit older, presumably, but that's still fine, I think. It was very hard to create the detailed instructions and videos. For every assignment, I also created another video talking them through what's expected. Using the different software packages approach was very tiring for me. I don't run regression in Excel, for example. I've never done that before, but I found out it's a bit more complex than I thought it would be. Yet now I know it's much easier, but doing both the two software packages approach obviously has increased the workload massively. Troubleshooting by email and virtual calls was a little bit tiring at some point, mostly very much towards the deadline, because students in pandemic or outside the pandemic still leave it to the last minute very often, and then you have a lot of calls on a day or on the day of the deadline. I think walking the extra mile with explanatory slides and notes was also a bit tiring, because probably had a different approach to that, and I figured I need to compile several sets of slides, which I don't think was necessary. I could have just cut them out of the videos that we were recording anyway, so that could be a little bit of relief in that sense. One big energy sucking aspect was not losing patience. And I tried to keep that in the live sessions and also in the videos, of course, and in my emails, but sometimes it was really draining to explain the same things over and over and over again, where I just wanted to say, just watch the video, it's all in the video, just rewatch the video. But obviously you want to be helpful, especially in this particular situation, and just say, try it this way, try it that way, have you tried it this way? But there were really, the patience part, I think, was one of the biggest aspects in this. Sorry, some concluding thoughts here. I just think this is called Betrayal and Forgiveness. I think betrayal is definitely okay. It's about finding the balance, how much betrayal is okay and how much you can actually cheat students into doing quantitative methods. But forgiveness is always on the horizon. I think I was overwhelmed by the feedback so far, and this course has run for a while now, that most people were actually really happy about this. I had one student, this was years and years ago, who actually said to me, I wasn't a good student, but your course was so great, and I did understand what I'm supposed to do. It was so systematic, and I think I have this systematic brain, and it's just nice to hear that. So the testimonials, the feedback was just outstanding. I think it's important to know yourself. What are you capable of? Do you want to put in this effort of compiling data sets, for example, of walking the extra mile, doing all the troubleshooting? You need to know your students. What can you expect from them? How much do you need to give them? How many hands do you need to hold along the way? But also potential organizational limitations, access to software, even recording software and things like that could be very tricky in teaching skills-based stuff. Once again, patience, and more patience is required for yourself, for your students, for your organization in this whole process. I think patience is the key word. And also, I think you shouldn't be afraid to learn from your own mistakes. I certainly made mistakes in developing this course, and it has developed further and further and further, and it will change probably to the next term for the next year once again. But it's really helpful to learn from some of the mistakes. Changing data around is not a problem. or giving them too much training in something, which is something that happened last year, for example, that they had too much training in how to conduct data analysis that everyone just did so brilliantly. So mixing up then assignments for this year was just essential to balance out all this good training that they received, for example. But that's like a minor mistake. It's not a big issue, but it's something that I had to learn from as well. And there's sure things that I can learn from during the pandemic year, for example, changing the reading list. I usually use this core textbook like Golda. 1 week before term this year, we had to shift around because we didn't have additional copies. The library didn't have the budget to buy additional copies, so everything had to move to journal articles, which was a challenge, but also interesting because you can make them read the original Lipset articles, for example, or even newer articles that just came out in 2020. The Journal of Democratization, for example, is a brilliant resource for that. I just want to close with this one. This was actually my last slide this year in the tutorial, and they enjoyed it, and I allowed them to draw, and they know I like whales. Maybe you see some whale pictures in the background here as well, but they enjoyed it and they had a good time, and they did want to get drunk with their mates as well. So thank you very much. Shall I stop screen sharing at this point?
Yes, please do.
Grant, thank you.
So we've now got a chance to ask any questions and explore further with Kathrin and Adrian. If anyone has any questions, just unmute, I think. Otherwise, Adrian, you can come in and stimulate us a bit with some discussion points. But over to everyone. If anyone just wants to unmute and ask a question, please do.
Hi, I thought that was really interesting. Thank you. And I do have a couple of questions. I realized just now that I find it really difficult to type out questions while listening, which I should probably think about as a teacher, because that probably means that some students also find that really hard. I think it sounds absolutely fantastic. A lot of work, but also like something that is really paying off, especially in terms of Kathrin, the assignments that you set and the fact that people were kind of choosing to go out and bring in different things and different data sources. Like I'm sure that you don't do that if you're not feeling comfortable or confident. So that's really great. I was wondering, you gave us obviously a pretty detailed overview of how the course works, but how do you try to structure that kind of learning curve? Is it a kind of learning to like read and interpret stuff before learning how to do it, or kind of both at the same time? And is it kind of all in the deep end at once, or like spread out over a term or a year? How do you try to manage that? And then I think for both Kathrin and Adrian, how do you see your courses like supporting students within the structure of their degree? So I guess for Kathrin, have you found that more students are either doing like quantitative dissertations, or at least integrating some form of quantitative element into their dissertations that they were not really doing before? And for Adrian, if they have a focus of like a course that's marketed as a methods course that they have to do later on, are they struggling less, finding that more comfortable, complaining less about doing that because they've had the like sort of easier introduction through a substantive course in the first year? And then, sorry, my one final question for Kathrin was with the I loved what you said about the kind of showing students how to do stuff through videos, and I also found it interesting that you give them the choice of using Excel or SPSS, which I can imagine also kind of adds to your workload a lot. Do you also have to come up with kind of like practical tasks for them to do in seminars, or are they left to kind of practice this all on their own? And how do you find that kind of working out? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Adrian, do you want to kick off just to give Kathrin a bit of a break?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of see this supporting the methods provisions that we have at Durham. So at Durham, they have a general research methods module at level 1, which is both quant, sang, qual, and background to research design. Then as they go through their options, including a module called analytical politics, which, deal with, regression and regression discontinuity and difference in difference models and, more sort of advanced stuff. But I think the one thing that never really goes away from modules that are core methods, and I think this is where, Kat teaching the methods directly in a substantive module is really, really useful. When you teach it as like its standalone module, I think you do still end up, even when you use lots of examples of students saying, but how is this relevant to my other modules? How does this fit in? Where am I going to use this? And I think having that sort of very clear methods application within substantive modules is where this becomes really, really helpful, because you're having them read lots and lots of substantive literature. And again, I think there is a tendency of particularly level 1 students to gloss over, like they're probably good at reading introductions and lit reviews, but the second they get to like the research design or the methods and the actual analysis, switching off and then immediately flipping to the conclusion, to get the summary of what the findings show. And I think by embedding these kinds of methods and like, okay, so how do we interpret a regression table? What's this graph showing us? Why should I pay attention to the type of data they have, or what type of sample they've collected, is really helpful in, really embedding those skills. And that translates, into every part of their degree. And also, as Kat pointed out, builds their employability skills as well.
Thank you. And Kathrin, would you like to add and address Ellen's other point?
Yeah, I can only echo what Adrian said. And in general, I think I just respond to the specific questions in addition to that. So for the course, for this particular course, I think I started predominantly with interpretation and reading of stuff. So they did get a little introduction to sort of reliability and validity, for example, when we talked about the different measures of democracy, where it was a bit more methodsy. But that, I think I kept that for the tutorial where we talked about the concept. Do we actually measure what we want to measure? Can we measure it repeatedly? But in a very simple way, once again, in like 2-3 slides, and then moved on to look, I recreated these timelines that you see in this book. It's actually this simple. Look at this, go to Excel, do this, click here, click there. And I think that was very much appreciated. I think as you say, the choice of software was hard work. I don't even know why I decided to do it in Excel and SPSS in the first place. I think at the time, I felt that students might be more inclined to do things if they have the option, if they did Excel. I have to say that things changed a little bit around in the department since I've started here as well. And we have a little bit more of SPSS training at level 3 now. So I think more students were inclined to actually use SPSS, and some actually want to learn this. And I actually recently, last week, had an email from a last year student who actually said, did you not teach us this SPSS stuff in the democratization module? Can you share the videos? Because I now have to do this. And I think that's once again a very nice testimonial for how well did this work. I can also maybe add that I've proposed to move this course from level 4 to level 3 so that they can actually use these skills for their dissertations, which for us run in the first half session in year 4. So my course runs in the second half session of year 4. So that's a bit nonsense. So I've proposed that now so that we can run it at level 3, so that it adds up to dissertation writing and things like that. I do see that I get more and more people who want to do quantitative stuff at dissertation level now too, but very slowly. And obviously there's also this misunderstanding between I want to do quantitative methods, but I don't actually want to analyze things quantitatively. I just want to gather quantitative data and interpret that. So I think that's still something where we need to be very precise as lecturers in general. I hope that answered everything.
Thank you. Christine, you've got your hand up. Would you like to pose a question live?
Yes, thank you. I have to apologize for the lack of video, but I'm on a very bad data connection. Thank you very much, Kathrin and Adrian. That was fascinating. I also kind of have previously sneaked in quantitative methods into my courses, and I was particularly keen to hear, Kathrin, on how you managed to get around this last year during COVID. Because did I understand you correctly that you pre-recorded your explanation sessions and then used your seminar to troubleshoot, or what did you actually then use the seminars for? Because I did it the other way around. I used seminars basically to demonstrate how they can do it, and I thought it was a bit of a waste of time because I felt that students probably rather could have done this in their own pace and then come to the seminar to ask me questions. How would you suggest to do this?
I can go straight away. Thanks for the question. I thought about that a lot over last year's summer, to be honest, as I adopted our big methods module as well, where we had the SPSS teaching. And I came to the conclusion, as you say, it might be a waste of time to do it live. So what I did, and I actually said to all the other tutors on the big module, do it as you please, but we have this pre-recording, so sort of the flipped classroom design. And for my own tutorials, I basically said to everyone at the very, very beginning, you have to watch these videos, you have to do these bits and pieces. So I had always had a part of the SPSS Excel, well, for that it was SPSS demonstration, where I talked them through the actual data to the actual assignment that they were given as a flipped classroom exercise. But then there was an added bit where they had to use different variables to basically do the same thing. And some of the tutors decided they want their students to email that in. Others did not. I made the decision that I said, you know, if you want to share your results with me, that's fine. I will not comment on everyone individually because we had roughly 200 students. So I then decided I go through them and I use the live sessions for troubleshooting and just say, I saw these common mistakes from the people who submitted, and here's how you avoid it. And I also offered, if there was the demand for it, do you want me to go into SPSS and show you live, which obviously can be a bit of a pressure as well. I tend to sometimes click on things and like, oh no, this is not how it works, but that's fine. Normally everyone appreciates to see some mistakes as well. But I think the flipped classroom worked really well, and I did it in the substantive module the same way, and they enjoyed it. I think they enjoyed doing things, just being creative and creating their own thing. That was a bit encouraging for students from my perspective.
Thank you, that's great. I'll definitely give that a go.
Thank you, Christine. Adrian, was there anything you wanted to kind of talk about or raise in terms of any other discussion points that we've not covered so far?
Yeah, I guess one sort of question for Kat, given that we've taken slightly different approaches to this. With the integration of, you know, sort of the original data analysis alongside it, have you found that within this approach, like the quality of the students' learning of the substantive theoretical side of democratization has suffered at the expense, or have they been able to manage these two sort of things pretty well alongside each other?
That's a good one. I need to think about that, to be honest. I think actually it didn't, I don't think it suffered because we had, if I can talk a little bit about the lectures. So we were advised to do little chunks of lectures. So I did restrict myself to 3 roughly 20-minute lectures, and there were 3 individual videos, so they could, I know students can pause, but I think they like if they have a complete video and then go to the next video. And then I had some panel discussions by other scholars or debates that I integrated as well. And that was more substantive. I usually try to do it in a way that I have the theories in the first 2 sessions lectures, and then the third one was a little bit more empirical. So you've now learned about the theories, let's see how we can test them, that kind of approach. If I think about my student representatives ran like a little survey for the class as well to give feedback. And if I go through the results that I got from them in that respect, I had 2 people who were a bit more critical about that and said, you know, I would have liked to learn more about other concepts of democracy, which in all honesty, I don't think should have been part of the course, the way the course was structured. But I think that was more, okay, we could have done a little bit more. Another thing that I think I can note here, once again, comparing last year and this year, the COVID year and the shift in the reading list was a bit more complex. So I thought it was quite exciting to give them like the original lip set work and essays and stuff like that. And admittedly, they have very simple quants. Some of them have very simple quants anyway. And I thought that was great because they can understand it easily, but then the language has changed as well, because in the 60s, I think scholars wrote somewhat more complex and less intuitive than scholars do these days. And I do recall another comment from that said student representative survey, which basically said, you know, some of these readings I just didn't understand. What did he mean by X, Y, Z? And I'm like, that's the old ones. You should read the new ones. That would be helpful. But it was a good mix. But I think, yeah, you can only try your very best, right? Someone will always complain about something. But in general, I think it works quite well.
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to check if there's any final questions, queries, discussion points we want to raise. No, I think we are done. So if I can say a heartfelt thank you to Kathrin and Adrian, it's absolutely fantastic and so interesting, and just is a complete throwback to when I went to uni as well. And you know, just brought it all back. So I'm desperate to actually do your courses now. So thank you for that. Mission accomplished. Just to remind people that we've still got 2 other webinars in the series. And so you can find more information on the PSA website under the Teaching Learning Network. So please take a look. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Video will be up once it's edited a wee bit, will be up very shortly, so people can refer to it afterwards. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.